Okay, so good afternoon. I'm going to tell you a bit about the time to event analysis, and it links a bit to the talk from my previous talk from my colleagues, in that they were concerned in kind of like if something will happen and how to evaluate risk in that context. Here we will kind of be considering the question of when, right? So, oh, by the way, there's a little bit too much text in the slides. Don't try to read it all. You can it's just to make them stand alone for later. But just listen to what I'm saying, and then I'll talk you through them anyways. So say you have a scenario where you're asked to predict how far into the future a certain event will occur. And the event can be anything. They can be, in the context of banking, could be a default, a loan application. In the medical context, it could be a death, an asthma attack, a stroke. It could be anything really. This framework is completely general. And say you have some relevant historical data on these events, so kind of their timings. And you also know some of the characteristics of the entities, right? So whether that's a client applying for a loan or that's a person who's unfortunately at risk of a stroke. So how would you approach this, right? And I'll give you a second or two to think about it while I switch slide. But there's basically two default approaches that you could go into kind of off the top of your head. And one of them is to say, all right, the target variable, which is time to event, is continuous. So this is a regression problem. I'm going to fit a standard regressor to it. Another way to do it is to say, all right, actually, I'm going to impose a time window. And I'm going to say this is a classification problem where if an event happens within the window, it's a 1. If it happens outside the window or not at all, then it's a 0. All right, and you could try to do that. And I'm going to argue that both of these approaches have downsides. And I'm going to propose a very well-known and, yeah, by now very mature solution. But okay, so I'll give you a brief overview of some of the drawbacks of these approaches. So if you decide to go for the regressor, then if you read the first line there, you can end up with predictions like, okay, if you were trying to predict loan applications, we can expect the loan application from this company in 1.246 years time. Yeah, that's not really a credible prediction, right? It's I mean, you can make it, but when the time comes, let's see if that actually happens, right? It's very unlikely unless the process is already very deterministic, in which case you don't need to model it like this. And also keep in mind, if you're training a regressor to time to event, then what do you do with the companies that say haven't applied for a loan yet? So there is no target variable there, right? They might apply later, but they haven't yet. And so are you going to drop them? But that presents other issues as well, right? Because you can do that in a training set, but in a test set, you wouldn't know in advance which ones are or aren't going to apply for a loan. So really, you can start to see that the whole scenario is a bit strained already. And if you go down the classifier route, then you can say, all right, what's the correct time window to use? And you can say, due to business reasons, it's this, but still, you're imposing a cutoff, right? If the event happens just outside the window, you pretend that it didn't happen at all. And so it's not really ideal. And within the window, you kind of say yes or no, but there's no measured probability, right? Of whether how sure you are that there will be an event. So oh yeah, and there's further drawbacks, which is that both of these approaches would neglect something which is very crucial to these problems in general, which is time at risk, right? So for example, the complete hypothetical here, by the way, this whole talk is about kind of toy problems and hypotheticals. Don't read into it because you'll just get false readings. But if say you're talking about probability of default, right? Say. And then, so you're not equally likely to default the day after the loan was granted as you are probably a year later, right? Or 2 years later, or 3 years later. So the time at risk, when you're at risk is when you have the loan, right? When you're given the loan, you become at risk, and the event of interest is, say, a default. So the time at risk is really a crucial predictor, right? You expect things to evolve over time, and the relevant time here is at risk, is time at risk. So that's another issue. And with a regressor, keep in mind as well, you could accidentally predict far outside of the data that you actually have. So quick example, but for example, it looks like with COVID, it looks like a good fraction of the medical profession even was a bit surprised by people having long-term symptoms, right? So you shouldn't really, if you only have follow-up time of a certain amount, you shouldn't really predict outside of that. But a regressor, if you give it the right inputs, will predict anything, right? Completely outside of the data you have. You don't want that. And these are all signs that the tools are not really fully fit for purpose, okay? So I'll make the case that due to all these reasons, treating it as a standard classification or regression problem is a bit of an issue. So going through the points quickly, what do we actually want? Point predictions like 1.246 are not really an option. We want to predict probabilities. Time dependence, we want to model that smoothly. We want to account for time at risk. We don't want to extrapolate, we don't want to have predictions outside of the region where we actually have data over. And causality must be respected at all times. So if you start conditioning on outcomes, so saying dropping the ones that haven't gotten the loan yet, well, you wouldn't know that at the beginning, so you probably shouldn't be doing that. So these are the desired kind of modeling characteristics, and there are very well-known models that kind of fulfill all these things and fix all the problems that I just posited to you. So this is a very well-known and studied problem, and medical trials, I'll give you an example in a second, rely heavily on this, and it's generally called survival analysis, time to event analysis, different names, it's the same techniques. And just for clarity, I'll frame everything from here on is where the event of interest is death, right? I have no medical background, I'm not an epidemiologist, do not read anything medical into this. This is purely as a toy problem, so you can see how you could apply it to the case that you're interested in, okay? So the simplest thing you can possibly do is to use life tables, where you literally count within this period of time, this many people died, and this many people were at risk at the beginning of the year, right? And Bernoulli started doing this in the 18th century, I believe, and they're still in use today. So if you look at the table at the bottom right, that's from the Office for National Statistics, and you'll see the column age, which is X, and you'll see a column called QX, which is explained on the left. But it's basically the mortality rate between time X and X plus 1, right? So it's the fraction of people who died in between that age and the next one, divided by the people who were alive at the beginning, right, of that period, using data from 2017 to 2019. So these are kind of good points to anchor your analysis on, and this is how you can start to calculate probabilities given event data, okay? And you can formalize this a little bit more, and you can start, right, there's this thing called the kappa meyer estimator. I'll explain what the equation is. So basically, if I is a given time, so in the previous table, that would have been an age, and lowercase t is a time that you're considering at the moment. So you want to say, what's the survival rate up to, 30 years old or something like that. And then di is the number of events you have at time I, and ni is the number of people who were at risk at the beginning of time I. So this is the proportion of people who had an event in time I, and 1 minus that is a proportion who survived, right? And if you multiply this factor over all the times that came before it, you basically get the overall survival rate. So if you 0.9 and 0.98 and you multiply those together to see what fraction would have survived by the end, okay? And this actually, it sounds incredibly simple, and it is, but it actually incorporates all the right things. So for example, the time at risk thing that we were mentioning, if you were at risk, you should be counted within the denominator in this n sub I, which means that it correctly includes all the people it should include. Because if you don't include if you were at risk and you're not included here, you're going to overestimate the probability of the event, and the other way around. Okay, so if you do this carefully enough, it's deceptively simple, but it actually should estimate the probabilities well, which if you do in other ways, you will get wrong in the way that I just mentioned, if you don't count the right people in. We assume non-informative censoring. I won't say much about that, but basically, you can think of it just to give you an idea of kind of how complicated these processes can be and why they're so tricky to get right. If you like, there's a process driving the event, in this case, death. But there's also, for example, other processes that could drive censoring. And censoring is when someone either makes it to the end of the trial and didn't have an event, or drops out of the trial, for example, because they move city and they stop going to the clinic, right? And there could potentially be that process could also be correlated to some of the covariates of the people, right, involved. And if that could completely affect the events you see and the ones you don't see. So it introduces a selection bias. So in general, it's a common assumption. You can deal with it if you suspect it's not true, but you kind of assume that the censoring is not informative. This is an example, again, taken from a preprint some months ago. I'm including it just because it's topical, just to see that these tools are used, but do not run away with any medical message out of here, because I'm completely not qualified. This is just to show you how these tools are used. So adult patients, the time 0 here is when adult patients come in into an intensive care unit. And then at that point, they're randomized to either receive this treatment, the one that begins with a T, the one that begins with an S, or they receive the standard care, right, and control. And what you're looking at here, this is the kappa and meyer curves, right? So if you look at the red curve, that's the control group. And it starts at 1, so everyone's alive at the beginning. And then every time it dips down, that means that someone unfortunately passed away at that point. And the tick marks means that someone's been censored, someone dropped out, okay? And at the bottom, you can see the number at risk. That's how crucial this kind of statistic is in survival analysis, that you usually want to include it. And it's important because, for example, here you could see that the middle treatment, the one with an S, actually has quite low numbers. So I wouldn't bet much that that line is statistically different from any of the other two. Okay, so this is the way these things can be assessed, but keep in mind you could do exactly the same thing for any other event that you're interested in, right? These tools are perfectly general. And just as a bit of good news, that a few months later, there's even bigger randomized trials seem to show that one of those treatments, the one that begins with a T, was for certain patients actually effective. And you can see these plots should start to look familiar to you. This is kind of 1 minus the one we were looking at before. But yeah, this is just to make the case that these tools are general and they're heavily used in the medical context. And it's for good reason, because they get a lot of things right, which are actually hard to get right otherwise. Okay, and one of the most common tools is actually Cox regression. And so I'll just walk you through it very quickly, because just in case you see it later, so you can kind of see how it works under the hood. So say you have a general measure of risk called hazard, and it's obviously going to be a function of time, and it's going to be a function also of covariates, right? So the kappa and meyer didn't include any covariates. We just said, what's the aggregate over, and you could plot it for different categories and see how they compare, but you didn't include covariates beyond that, right? And that's for categoricals. What if you have something continuous? So here you can include covariates, and this measure of risk has to be non-negative, right? If you're not at risk, then it's 0, and if you are at risk, then it's positive, but it doesn't make sense for it to be negative. And we want it to be mathematically tractable. Otherwise, this is kind of a black box, which we're trying to avoid, right? If you want to do some well-understood statistical inference, then the simpler the estimator, the better, right? Okay, so the exponential function is kind of satisfies both of those requirements, right? It's strictly non-positive, and it's kind of mathematically simple. So we say the hazard function is the exponential of this other function f, which we don't know yet. And now we're going to make some more assumptions so we can actually come up with a mathematical form of something we can fit. And we're going to say, all right, you know what? The dependence on the covariates and on the time, we're going to split it. And inside the exponential, it's additive. At the hazard level, it's actually multiplicative, as you can see here. So the hazard breaks down into a product of it depends only on the time and only on the covariate. And now let's make a further assumption and say that the dependence on the covariates is purely linear. Okay, simplest possible thing you can do. And we're also going to relabel this, the exponent of the exponential of L of t, the time dependence, into H0 of t, which is called the baseline hazard. This is a model proposed by Sir David Cox in 1972, and this is the standard workhorse in survival analysis. There are many kind of improvements to it over the years, etc. But yeah, this is kind of just so you understand. These are the sort of assumptions, and then you can. It's not a linear regression, but you can see where the betas are. You can see that you're going to fit some time dependence and you're going to fit the betas. So it's just to give you an idea of what this would look like. And using this, you can predict survival probabilities. I won't tell you how because I don't have the time, unfortunately, but you can look it up. And just to say, the way I presented in the previous slide, it looked very kind of ad hoc. I kind of just waved my hands around and made some arguments and came up with a form. But you can also motivate this from kind of a more rigorous mathematical arguments that are based in counting process theory. So yeah, if you're interested, you can go to this paper, for example. One thing that I will say, just because it's kind of crucial if you're going to use these things, is they have an assumption, which is that they're proportional hazard models, and it's both a feature and a bug. The bug is that if this assumption doesn't hold, then the model is not really appropriate. The feature is that if it approximately holds, then it gives you something very interpretable. I'll show you what. So if you consider the hazard of two different people with covariates xi and xj, and you just take the ratio, what you'll notice is that the time dependence doesn't actually have any dependence on the person, right, on xi or j. So that cancels. And this will be crucial for something that I'll show you in the next slide, but it basically, you can get an exponential of beta, which you can then interpret, and that's called a hazard ratio. And you can directly read from it whether, for example, if X was a treatment and this is actually the same person, and you just consider kind of the same person with treatment or the same person without treatment, then this would give you exponential of beta, because this is 1. And that would give you an indication of whether if this is greater than 1, then the treatment is actually harming, it's increasing risk. If it's less than 1, it gives you an improvement. And if, say, you got x beta equal to 0.6, then that's where you get the headlines in the news saying that this treatment reduces the risk by 40%. Okay, and it's kind of true, but it's also, you got to be careful how you interpret hazard ratios. But yeah, the point here is that the time dependence canceled out, so that the hazard between two people is actually the same. The ratio between them is the same overall time. They're proportional. And actually, speaking of logistic regression, like the previous talk, if this looks too alien to you, then if you take a logarithm here on the left, then you get log of hi over hj equals x beta, essentially. And that looks a lot like a logistic regression, right? Where it would be log of p over 1 minus p, the odds. So you can think of it as kind of similar in that regard. And yeah, as I was saying before, this hazard ratio is just the ratio of two hazard functions. And I'll show you in a second how this actually looks. But if the hazard ratio is bigger than 1, then clearly, okay, if you multiply it h by h of tx on both sides, then you can see that if this is bigger than 1, then the hazard actually went up, right? When you increase this covariate. And this covariate could be, for example, it's 0 here, no treatment, and it's 0 here, plus 1, so it's 1 for treatment. So yeah, if the hazard ratio is bigger than 1, then you increase the risk. If it's lower than 1, then it lowered it. And from the kappa and meyer, you can also do a Logrank test to see if you can reject the null hypothesis that the curves that you observed were drawn from the same survival function or not. Okay. So yeah, so hopefully the previous example where we saw the low statistics, hopefully it would fail to reject, for example. But although that was comparison between 3, and you would have to pre-specify everything, of course. Anyways, but that's I'll leave the details to you. I'll show you how this actually looks like, because when you first look at a survival analysis data set, it looks quite different. So if these were, say, loan applications, or, well, okay, let's stick to death. So I said I was going to stick to that. So so this would be kind of the time of death and the covariates that you might get the data in that form to begin with. But you have to transform this where DI is this indicator variable, where you set it to 0 if they were censored. So if the trial ended and they were still alive, thankfully, or if they dropped out of the trial, so you didn't observe the final outcome. And TI is the time at which that happened. So, and XI is their usual covariate. So to show you more kind of exactly how that looks like, this is a famous Rotterdam breast cancer data set. Well, it's 5 rows of it. It's bigger than that. But so you see the patient ID, age, pre or post menopause, the size of the tumor, grade, nodes. There's some other medical covariates here. And then this is the T variable, the time. And this is, okay, death here, they were all censored. So this person was censored at time after 2,690 days. But if anybody here had died, this would be a 1, and then you would know that that person died after 4,533 days, right? So that's how, this is how survival analysis data sets often look like. And now I'll show you. This is, if you fit a kappa and meyer to that data set, you get this. And in R, by the way, this is literally those 2 lines give you this. So it's kind of very easy to do. And here you're telling it, yeah, well, I won't go into the details, but so this is for all the patients there in that data set. But say you start stratifying on a certain level of a categorical, right? As I kind of showed you before with the treatments for COVID. So say you stratify on tumor size, okay? Then here you can see, you can at least very easily see that, for example, the people with the smaller tumors, they had a higher survival probability, right? And then the middle ones were in the middle, and the ones without, and this is the tumor size at time 0, by the way. That's an important detail. So you can straight away see kind of certain dependencies in the data, and you can be fairly certain that these probabilities that you're estimating are reasonable, okay? So which would be hard to do if you essentially, if you try to do this with regression in your own way, or et cetera, you end up reinventing this if you want to get it correct. So it's really a good way to do it. You could also look at, for example, another categorical, so premenopausal or postmenopausal, and then you can see that the risk is higher for postmenopausal, for example. And here, if this had all been pre-specified, then you can do a Logrank test, which would rule out the null that these were drawn from the same survival function. So you can say they're statistically significant in terms of the differences. Okay. And if I fit a Cox model, never mind most of so you have the standard error and you have the beta, but the one I want to draw your attention to is this one, exp of coef. So coef here is the beta. So you can see that menopause, this one is the first level with respect to the 0 level. So postmenopause has a risk of 1.46. This is a hazard ratio relative to premenopausal. And yeah, you can see, for example, for the largest tumor size, this is relative to the smallest tumor size, it's 3.6. So you can see that here, clearly, these things are associated, not necessarily causal. That takes extra assumptions and randomization, et cetera, but these things are associated with higher risks. And just to say last few things in terms of performance. So if you wanted to predict, you're predicting probability, so you need to use an appropriate performance measure. This is the C index, and you can compare, for example, this paper from 2017, which compared Cox proportional hazard versus an adapted deep learning model versus random survival forest, which is random forest adapted for survival analysis problems. And you can see that in many problems, for example, the Rotterdam dataset, the performance is not actually that different, right? Except the deep survival model has, I don't know how many parameters and takes, I don't know how much computation to fit. And you can't, well, you're going to struggle to get interpretable things out of it. I can't remember if the authors of that paper actually said much about that or not. But whereas here, I showed you, you have the hazard ratios, which you can kind of interpret easily, and the performance is competitive, not the same, but so it's really something that you should always use as a benchmark if you are doing survival analysis projects. So you'll have to check the proportional hazards assumption that it holds approximately or not. But anyways, there's a lot of things here that I didn't mention. So someone could, for example, go between premenopausal and postmenopausal in that trial. So the X would change value during the trial. One covariate which might induce lower risk at one time might later time induce higher risk. There could be competing risks. People can die from all sorts of causes. The censoring might be informative, and many of these are taken care of in these new techniques called landmarking and joint modeling. And you can Google those just to see if you want to read more about them. Otherwise, for further reading, I can recommend the one on the left, the self-learning text. It's a kind of written in plain English. The one in the middle is a usage guide from world experts in survival analysis. So it's a good one to read if you're going to use survival analysis, because it's full of do's and don'ts. And the one on the left, on the right, all the way to the right, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The first edition did not include survival analysis. The upcoming second edition will. So it's also something that which they've deemed important enough to include. And yeah, last thing, if you're going to do survival analysis, preferably use R. That's the most complete packages and mature are there. But if you want to use if you want to do it in PyTorch and do it in Python, then yeah, that's this personal project which you can submit a pull request to, etc. And yeah, have fun. But yeah, preferably do it in R if you're going to do it. And I think that is it. Thank you.